How you guys doing? Right on. Amazing conference. This is a lot of hard acts to follow. So this is the My Story JS portion of the show. And when Anna asked me to tell my story, I felt awkward about it. I don't really like talking about me. And I feel it's like a little bit, a bad way to like deliver an argument if you use your resume. So this really isn't about me, but I do like talking about stories, and I think stories are actually a really great way to how we define our culture, any culture. And so I'm going to tell you guys some stories. I spent the first half of my software career witnessing how software probably shouldn't be written, and so I kind of feel like I'm taking the second half of my career, or well, what I hope is a lot longer, to atone for that. And so we're going to start with a little bit of UNIX philosophy. Now, this is Rule 16, the Rule of Diversity, from Eric S. Raymond's amazing book, The Art of UNIX Programming. And it's kind of my big disclaimer for this whole talk. The idea of distrusting all claims of one true way really means that we want to observe that things change in software. They change everywhere. And in our industry, especially on Hacker News, we get in these arguments that are a waste of time. We get into these sort of polarized debates, these sort of religious arguments. And usually these things manifest with instruments of FUD that I think could be argued one way or the other. When you look at software characteristics, you can almost always argue for or against something from a performance perspective. Node.js is always slower than assembler. Microsoft is always insecure. Whatever. So we don't need to really get into these debates. And the whole point of distrusting all claims of one true way, or what I'm trying to say is, I'm not telling you I know the one true way to build software. These are just sort of ways. And these ways have worked for me, but you should let your own direct experience guide you. So Doug McGilroy said, make each program do one thing well. To do a new job, build afresh, rather than complicate old programs by adding new features. This is the dude that invented UNIX pipes. He's an amazing software engineer, and his contributions are still being lived today. Pipes are probably the reason that Node is so compelling right now, more streams rather. So I'd like to simplify this. He said do one thing well. I think you can just do one thing, and you'll get to well eventually. The classic example of this is comparing a Swiss Army knife to a hammer. The hammer is obviously more effective, or a kitchen knife. Dave Thomas and Andy Hunt had a great book called The Pragmatic Programmer, and they said abstractions live longer than details. And I really like that idea. And so you want to have one thing that really guides you, one thing that drives your project that you're working on, one thing to look at when you're building your stuff, the guiding light for what you're doing. The guiding light for what you want to build. When we started the PhoneGap project in 2008, we didn't want to build that thing. We wanted to build web apps. And so the first guiding light and principle that we put together was that we wanted it to cease to exist. And I was studying Eastern philosophy at the time, so I thought it sounded really cool. But this has resonated with our community and with developers everywhere, and I think this guiding light has really driven us to the architecture we're into today and into the world that we're starting to see today. I don't think we're responsible for seeing the web as a first-class development platform, but I think we're, at least in part, contributing to the idea that operating systems like Firefox OS, Chrome OS, and even Windows, you can build first-class applications using web technologies. There's another project I work on more recently called Topcoat, and Topcoat is a CSS library. And when we set out to build this thing, we didn't set out to build yet another CSS library. We were setting out to actually solve a very big problem in CSS, and that's slow. And so it's a little more tactical, but our guiding light for Topcoat is performance first. And I really like that. So do one thing well, and do it poorly, and iterate on it and get better. That's my first observation. So we often confuse principles with practices in software development, and I think this leads to bad code and bad decision making. Best practices are temporal. Best practices change over time. When we have a best practice and it becomes a new best practice, that's actually what innovation is. So best practices tend to go away, but principles, they have staying power. And so an example of this, we know that we have the principles of revision control, testing, and automation, and we know those things are probably good ideas. And we've got things like Git and Mocha and Grunt, but 5-10 years ago we had SVN, JUnit, Make. So these things will change. There's no reason to believe for any second that Git is the last revision control to ever be around, and there's probably no reason to think that Grunt and Mocha are going to be around forever too. No one knows who said this first. Well, I wanted to attribute it, but Jeff Atwood, anyways, has a great blog post about this. The idea is that you can have a strong opinion weakly held. It's good to have strong principles, but to always question your practices. The next little observation that I've had recently, so this is a Hacker News favorite. People think this is a myth. It's not. I work with a lot of these people. You probably work with a lot of these people. We see them all the time, the 10x developer. So the 10x developer isn't the guy who stays late. The 10x developer has humility. And this is the recognition that we're working towards a common goal together. Software is a collective enterprise. It is a communication exercise that requires us to collaborate with each other. This is really true with open source. So you can't get attached to your code. You are not your code. Another quality of the 10x developer is empiricism. So we're not interested in subjective debate. We're interested in working together, using numbers and things like CI and automation to prove what we're doing, to benchmark ourselves. Automation is also an important thing. 10x developers don't repetitively do tasks. They don't go in and check something and then do a bunch of manual stuff and then find a bug and then fix it and go redo that. They write tests and they automate, and that's why they're so damn productive. And testing is obviously another big part of that. The last thing I've noticed with 10x developers is that they practice all the time. So at the last JSConf, I was sitting with Remy Sharp and I kept looking over and I'm like, what are you working on? He was building a game using the HTML5 audio API. And I'm like, why? He's like, oh, because it's cool. I want to learn how to use it, and so I'm going to try and build a game today. And so in between every session, it wasn't enough that he was at a conference learning. He had to build a game. And I've worked with Remy in the past on other projects, and he's one of those 10x developers. And it's not because he's smarter or better or anything. It's just because he practices all the time. So if you want to be a 10x developer, all you have to do is emulate these traits, and you too can enjoy a huge boost in productivity. I'm stealing this one from Adam Baldwin from And Yet. His concept here is more about humility again, about putting people first. So the only productivity optimization that I'm really interested in is seeing that our team is happy. We can put a whole bunch of rules together, a whole bunch of processes in place, and your software is going to suck because people are going to hate each other and they're not going to work well together. This is really the secret to building a great team. So we know this to be true when we're building large systems, that distributed systems are more fault tolerant. This is true with human systems too. Centralized command and control structures have a single point of failure. They tend to lead to bad software decisions, and they usually fail. And so this is an attribute of creating more resilient software, even in your teams. And we see this play out at Apache all the time. The Cordova project has IBM, Adobe, BlackBerry, Google, Intel, and others collaborating to ship software every month. If any one of those cogs goes out of the wheel, we're still going to be able to turn a release. So that's a big deal. Being excellent to each other is a part of our job. Dispassionate discourse is far better than a passionate developer who gets all angry on a mailing list. Shitty people do not change the world for the better. Toxic attitudes don't help. You have to have empathy and teamwork. We have to be respectful to each other. I don't mean you have to be positive all the time. That's disingenuous. I want to know when I fuck up. I just don't want to hear it from a dick. Tim O'Reilly is really famous for saying, create more value than you capture. I think he's wrong. I think you get more value the more you give away. If you share everything you know with everybody you meet, at some point you're going to learn that everyone has something to teach you. It's good to have this slide when you're giving a big presentation. I like the idea of equanimity. I love working with software developers that are like this. People that are just chilled out. So those people are usually working on something other than software. They usually take time to have a break, work with their families, work on themselves, do something weird, nothing to do with software. I think of Remy again because he builds Legos. So that's people first. When we first started building the PhoneGap project, we didn't have a choice. We had to do this stuff. When we were building for these mobile devices, they were very hostile environments. They did not have any form of automation built in. You didn't have debuggers. You couldn't remote inspect. We had to write unit tests, and we had to constantly do these builds. It was really difficult to do. These days, mobile development's a lot easier. You have things like Appium that can make it magical almost. You can play a guitar while you test. One of the big early mistakes that we made, we had our code up on GitHub, we tagged it 0.08, and we're like, okay, we know what we're doing. And we started iterating furiously, and people were filing bugs because our software was buggy. All software is, it's not a big deal. And they'd be like, oh, I have this bug, and I'd be like, oh, weird, I don't have that bug. And I'd look, and I'd be like, well, just use master. And we kept saying that to people, and we had no way to isolate our bugs. And we realized that bugs are really just numbers, and those numbers should be attached to a release. And the smaller the space between releases, the higher likelihood that you can have a quality release, and the easier it is to deal with fixing regressions. So release cadence is hugely important. Silicon Valley has this idea that you should embrace failure, and that bad track records are an indicator that you might do better in the future. It's fucking stupid. It's not like that. It shouldn't be like that. Failure is not acceptable. Regressions today shouldn't happen. If you have a bug, you should write a test immediately, and then it should never manifest again. And I think build systems and CI are advanced enough that we don't have to see this happen, ever. So if you can't do this, then it's awesome because you know the first thing that you need to do. And that's to build in a way to measure something. And this builds into the empiricism and dispassionate discussion. Like, no more subjective discussions. Let's figure out what we're measuring and let's measure it. Every software project should have these two commands, and everybody on the team should be able to run them. That's all I got to say about that. So there's an exception to this rule. With PhoneGap and Apache Cordova, we use a monthly release cadence. Chrome and Firefox do a 6-week release cadence. The exception to this rule is if you write small modules that do one thing really well, you might not have to release it anymore at all. You might hit a point where it's so well tested and so well used that it just ships. It's out there and it lives. So this is more of a systems design maxim. Okay. Open source sounds cool, but open force sounds cooler. So I'm going to talk about the open force. The web is this big evolving commons, and we're seeing for real now that the open source world is definitely the right way to build software. Proprietary systems are brittle. They go away. They get deprecated. Companies will just like wipe them out. And if you build your business on that force, proprietary code, your whole business is brittle. So this doesn't just count for proprietary code, but Brendan Eich famously calls this open washing. There's projects out there where there's source code, but there's no clearly defined contribution process. So that's not really open source, that's just source. And I call that siloed code often. And so you want to avoid projects that claim they're open, but they're not, because they suffer the same brittleness. I'm going to argue that open source is just superior because it's operationally more effective, It creates higher quality code, it's faster, and it moves our craft forward. So operational efficiency, you get to reuse your skills, you get to reuse your code. You have natural interoperability between team members and between products. The outcome of this is that you get to focus on your differentiations, and you don't have to, you can minimize your generalized repetitious work. You also get operational excellence. So an open source project these days has to have regular releases in order for the community to believe that it's healthy. You have to have CI testing and benchmarking to understand how your code is working so that the developers can collaborate all over the world. You have to have shared defect management, which is great. That means other people are fixing your bugs. And you have to have you minimize your security service because you get peer review. The result is higher quality code. So these are the open forces. You want to avoid proprietary code, avoid code in silos, and enjoy higher quality releases. All of this in aggregate moves our craft forward. We get to build on the commons that we've built together, and that's a big win. So these are the 7 observations that I've made in the last few years. I don't have to iterate them again for you. And if any of these things are interesting to you, you could consider joining me at the 2 open source projects that I'm working on primarily now. And that's it.